time retired from politics, but on the board of the Montana Historical Society in Helena, and came into my office and started pitching me, trying to get me to advocate for this historic preservation grant program that the Historic Society and Bob himself had a big hand in. And because Bob, 26 years in the legislature, when you're at the legislature for 26 years, you're probably pretty good at convincing people to do things. So I signed up right away and wrote letters of support and jotted down my name and all of that stuff. After he left the Historical Society in Helena, after he left the State Historical Society board, he joined our board here at the Northwest Montana Historical Society. And it was that time where I got to work with Bob on a more close level. I remember, for this same historic preservation grant, I remember Bob and I did a road trip of sorts to Helena, where Bob then introduced me to all of his colleagues at the State Historical Society, and then went to the grant office and sat down with them and talked about the needs of this building and how to kind of craft them and tailor them for this new grant program that Bob, and by association myself, had so firmly endorsed. And I appreciate very much Bob for doing that. What struck me on that trip was,
we got the money too.
We got the money. We got the money. So the trip not wasted for sure. What struck me the most was, 3.5 hours to Helena, 3.5 hours back. I'll tell you that 7 hours felt like 10 minutes, because talking to Bob is such a pleasure and a treat, and he's so full of knowledge and wisdom, and just hearing all of his stories and hearing how much he's done in his career was really, really impressive, and I just felt so honored to ride along with you that day, Bob, and to work with you and have known you since. The last thing I'll say before I'll turn over to Bob. Bob, I think you ran for lieutenant governor, or you were on the ticket, the Republican gubernatorial ticket in
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, 2004?
2000.
2000.
And then I ran for governor.
Then you ran for, yep, and you lost. That just shows you how much the state has changed. A man with an R next to his name can lose in a statewide race. But, yeah, so that's all I've got. Bob Brown, everybody.
Thank you very much. We're not entirely sure this works. Can you hear in the back?
I can turn it up a bit.
Raise it up a little.
Perfect. Is that a little better? I can hear us better. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. I know some of you for quite a while, several of you, and I met the people I didn't know, most of you, earlier this evening. And it's a pleasure to see you here and to know that you have an interest in history. There are some people here who I think maybe of the tender age where they might have remembered Burton Wheeler as the U.S. Senator from Montana. Now, I'm not trying to expose anybody, but if you remember the name Burton Wheeler, even if you don't remember he was a senator, raise your hand. Yeah. Well, he was really one of Montana's most important U.S. senators. And he was a big-time senator right from the time he got to Washington, D.C., even as early in his first term in office. But when he was an old man, I think he was about 88 or 89, if my math is right, I met him in his home in Washington, D.C. And his eyesight was so poor that he had one of those, we called them study lamps in college. They're a gooseneck lamp. And that was fixed right on his dinner plate so he could see to eat. And he was taken care of after his wife died, but I think to some extent even before that was the case, by an old gentleman when I was there named Simeon. And he was a Filipino, worked in his house, and got his meals and took good care of him. And he waited on us hand and foot, and I don't remember the meal, but I remember it was a real fine one, and it was just the senator and I in this big old brick house, Foxhall Road, if that means anything. I think that's where it was. That's a
Very Tony area in Washington DC,
Okay,
housing.
he had a brick house, I remember, in that area. And so I thought, well, because I'd heard of him when I was a kid. I was always interested in politics, and I remembered he was still alive and lived back in Washington DC, so I was assigned there when I was in the Navy. I was just an enlisted man. And I got a telephone number for him and called me up, and he said, absolutely, come over and join me for dinner. He had a very heavy Massachusetts accent, which he never lost. Came from the Boston area, I think, and I wish I could imitate it because was kind of his persona. And he always smoked cigars. I bet he smoked 10 of them a day at least. And anyway, I was really surprised at how direct he was. He had this kind of a raspy voice, but it was a voice you kind of naturally took seriously. And his face would lighten up, and he could be pleasant, even kind of funny, but I just knew, boy, if you ever got crossways with this guy, he'd be a Bengal tiger. And there were a lot of people that ended up learning that the hard way in the 20 years, or the 24 years that he spent as the United States Senator from Montana. One of the things I remember he said was that he deeply disliked Senator James Murray from Montana. And Murray was regarded as the most liberal man in the U.S. Senate. In fact, I think there's a quote I've got on something I've got was published back in the early 1950s. And he's quoted as saying, keep up the fight for a Soviet America. And you'd think that would have defeated him for sure during the McCarthy era, but it didn't. He had a real hold on the voters in Montana. And the other one that surprised me a little bit was Mike Mansfield.
You didn't like him?
He said, you know, if you get elected United States Senator, you have some power and influence to make important decisions and to affect government in a way that you believe. And Mansfield is a gutless, so on and so forth. I think he described him a little more graphically than that. And that he just never stood for anything. Well, people who lived through the Vietnam War know that Mansfield took a side, but it was a kind of a Mike Mansfield kind of a stand. He was the classic diplomat. In fact, he was elected U.S. Senate Majority Leader following Lyndon Johnson from 1962 to 1978. And that position is chosen by all the Democratic senators in their caucus. He not only won it every Congress, and the Congresses occur every 2 years, but without a single person ever running against him. Now, I don't know how you could hardly do that, but Mansfield had a calm way and a reassuring way of getting big things done, such as the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And during the Vietnam War, when it was really tough to get 2/3 vote on anything, Mansfield managed to do that on more than one thing. So he was a consummate legislator for sure. And I thought that then. Rick? Oh,
I got it.
okay,
One more?
let me just raise my finger.
Yep.
Okay, some of you may recognize that if you've been in the state capitol, that's in the rotunda. And Wheeler is one of, I think, 3 people in the rotunda. The other one is Tom Walsh, who was his colleague in the U.S. Senate, and Joe Dixon, who has always been my political hero, Theodore Roosevelt Republican. And but that shows that even though he became controversial leader in his terms in office, he was plenty respected enough to warrant that place in the Capitol Rotunda. In fact, I was a young senator, or young representative, I guess then, who voted to put that there. Now, it's kind of hard to describe Burton K. Wheeler simply and quickly. The book on the left is the one I took the most information from in preparing for this talk. But the one on the right, by Mark Johnson, who's written biographies on several prominent Northwestern Americans, is the newest one. It's a tome. It's big. And you better want to be interested in Wheeler to read it. But it's really detailed and really comprehensive. And Wheeler was he was a hellraiser. I don't think there's anything that says it better than that. He was a wheeler and a dealer and a superb master of the rules in the U.S. Senate, and had many friends, but he wasn't afraid of a fight, and that might be why he had the opinion he seemed to have about Mansfield. Mansfield was a mediator and a conciliator. Wheeler was going to stand up for what he thought, and if he ruffled feathers, okay. And so those covers, I think, kind of tell who he is. This is a guy who was governor of Montana when Wheeler was just starting out in politics. And he's not very well favored by historians. He was an Anaconda Company Democrat, and that was back when the Anaconda Company had huge power in the Montana legislature. And he tended to serve their bidding on most important things. Now, maybe I should backtrack a little bit. I mentioned Tom Walsh, didn't I? Well, Walsh was the senior senator in Montana. He wasn't the senior senator at that time, but he was when Walsh was in the Senate. But anyway, he entered the U.S. Senate at the time that Woodrow Wilson was president. So you had a Democrat senator from Montana and a Democrat president. And Walsh was really impressed with Wheeler. Wheeler was a member of the state legislature. He was a really crackerjack good plaintiff's attorney. Loved to sue the railroad, loved to sue the Anaconda Company. And he was pretty good. And the story, of course, is, maybe you've heard this too, he got off the train in Butte on his way to Seattle right after he got out of law school. Lost everything in a poker game in Butte. That's not the first time that's ever happened. And so he had to stay there. He got a job as a clerk to get clothes to wear and that sort of thing, and eventually became a very successful lawyer and a very excellent state legislator. So anyway, Walsh thought, well, I can spot a real comer when I see one. So he appointed him United States District Attorney. And that was at a time when it was called the first Red Scare. And there was the Attorney General at the time, maybe, do you remember the name? A. Mitchell Palmer? Yeah. The Palmer raids. Well, there was a feeling, and it really was really strong in Montana, that there needed to be some way or other to protect the country from spies and possible saboteurs. And of course, the Kaiser and the Germans were number one on everybody's list to be suspected. And so Stewart created the Montana Espionage Act. They had espionage committees around the state, and they were all ferreting out people who were controversial and had left-wing ideas and that sort of thing. But all you needed to do to get in trouble was have a German accent. That's about all it amounted to. I've got a quote here, I think. Here we go, and I probably can't see it. But this is a direct quote. Governor Stewart was behind this, but this was passed by the Montana legislature and carried by our senator, Henry L. Myers, the one in addition to Walsh, back to Washington, D.C., where he gave it to, well, I'll see if I can read this to you first. This is from the Espionage Act, enacted by Montana. We were the first in the country to do this. And I'll just read to you some of it. Any person or persons who shall utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, violent, scurrilous, contemptuous, slurring, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the soldiers or sailors of the United States, or the flag of the United States, or the uniform of the Army or Navy, or shall utter, print, write, or publish any language calculated to incite or inflame resistance to any constituted federal or state authority in connection with the prosecution of the war, shall be guilty of the crime of sedition. Pretty serious offense. And it's pretty hard to imagine how anything like that could be constitutional. Anyway, any of us understand that today. But that's what it said, and Myers thought, well, gee, that's a great idea. So he took it to the Attorney General of the United States and gave it to, doesn't he look like it's Doug? And he hoped to be president. He was a member of the cabinet, the Attorney General, and he was excited about the possibility that he might go on to the White House. And so he got, with his great assistance, got Congress to adopt the same espionage act for the country. Pretty tough stuff for the whole country. And, well, he was the guy, I can't read with my old eyes anymore. Yeah, he was really who we identify with America's first Red Scare, different than the McCarthy period in the 1950s. And he conducted Palmer raids all over the country, trying to get people convicted of this stuff that was in the Montana Act. I think I was going to add something here. Go ahead, Jake. You'll have to bear with me on this. Wheeler ran for governor, and they nicknamed him Bolshevik Bert because he was cracking down on these people who were cracking down on the left-wingers. And really what Wheeler was more than anything else was a civil libertarian. And I think a lot of people didn't really understand that about him. He was accused late in his career of being a Nazi sympathizer, and he was accused early in his career of being a Bolshevik sympathizer. Another nickname he had was Bolshevik Bert, also Boxcar Bert. And what happened there was he was giving a speech in Dillon, and some of his rhetoric got pretty hot. He was running for governor in 1920, and some of his rhetoric got kind of hot. And so a gang of cowboys chased him out of town, and he managed to hold up in a boxcar. So there was Bolshevik Bert holed up in the boxcar during the night. And he rather liked to tell the story, too. He was kind of proud of that. And you'd think that Montana being a red-blooded kind of a state like we still are, and probably were then, that wouldn't alarm us as much as it did. But they pretty much agreed with Wheeler. And part of the reason for that is there were a lot of Germans in Montana. I think next to the Irish and English, the Germans were the biggest group of people that came out from the Dakota and Minnesota and had settled the whole High Line, Germans and Scandinavians. But anyway, he got the Democratic nomination, but went on and got defeated in the general election. Somebody here who's a Montana historian, do you know who beat Wheeler in 1920 for governor of Montana? This might be best known to me because of my personal interest in this. Joe Dixon, who was the old Teddy Roosevelt progressive Republican, who got the Republican nomination in spite of the Anaconda Company opposition, because the alternative to Joe Dixon was Burton Wheeler. They were between the devil and the dark blue sea, so they figured at least Dixon is reasonable, and Wheeler just a wild man. And so he went ahead 2 years later, after that horrible defeat by Joe Dixon in 1920, and ran for the U.S. Senate. And I would think, well, golly, when you're beaten by better than 2-1, wouldn't you think just 2 years later you'd be in big trouble? Well, he wasn't. You see, the Depression came 10 years early in Montana. We had grasshoppers eating all the crops. We had low prices after World War I. And so our Depression in Montana essentially lasted from about 1920 to about 1938, maybe, something like that. And people in hard times sometimes go for people with radical ideas, and Wheeler played it to the hilt. He campaigned hard in the labor unions, in the farmers union, and all kinds of people who were kind of down and out in the political system. And he spared anybody that was rich and was opposed to him. Wheeler would take him on fearlessly. And he won. Almost incredibly, but he won. And went back to Washington, D.C., and you know, I'm not sure I can tell the story as completely as I should, but you've heard of the Teapot Dome scandal, haven't you? Well, that was when the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of the Navy got together and they took some federal land that had big oil deposits in the Teapot Dome Formation in Wyoming and the Elk Hills Formation in California. And so Albert B. Paul, the Secretary of the Interior, thought, well, boy, there's some real opportunity to make some money off of that. So he got a hold of Secretary Edwin Denby, who looks kind of like an Edwin Denby. And he got him to agree to turn those Navy oil reserves, they were set aside for the Navy, to take them from the Department of Navy and turn them over to the Department of Interior. And then, quicker than you can wink, he leased them to Henry Sinclair and another guy about that same vintage, I think, who had the Marathon Oil Company. And they paid him big bribes to do this, but then they just milked those formations. Well, Walsh figured out that from Montana Senator Walsh and started to investigate it. And he worked on it and worked on it and got lots of publicity for it and that sort of thing. But the big problem in stonewalling his investigation was a guy by the name of Harry Doherty. And Doherty was the Attorney General in the Harding administration. And Wheeler was kind of aware of him anyway, because he was I shouldn't keep on asking you, heard somebody earlier, but during that period of time, Warren Harding came into the White House. He was a poker player and a drinker and a skirt chaser and that sort of thing, but he didn't let being elected president after Prohibition slow him down completely. And Doherty, his Attorney General, who had come from Ohio with him, because Harding had been a senator from Ohio before him, was the biggest bootlegger you could imagine. And there was a place in Washington, D.C. that was called the Little Green House, and that was kind of the headquarters for the Ohio gang. And Doherty was the key to the Ohio gang. And they took booze by the case up to the White House for the president's poker games, and, you know, it was all really a bad deal. And so Walsh knew about that, and so did the new Senator Wheeler. And Wheeler just was disgusted by the whole thing and the hypocrisy involved in it, everything like that. So he launched his own subcommittee. Wheeler had the main subcommittee tracking down the Ohio, well, not the Ohio game, but the Teapot Dome scandal. And so, related to that, Wheeler got his own subcommittee, just as a freshman senator, to investigate essentially the Ohio gang. And he went after Doherty like, you know, Doherty didn't even know what hit him, because this guy was like a 2-year U.S. senator or something like that. But Wheeler, even at that early age, got his own subcommittee appointed, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, but he had enough influence then to influence the Senate Majority Leader to make one of the Republicans as critical of the Ohio gang as he was. And Wheeler went after the Ohio gang and forced Doherty out of office in disgrace. The interesting thing about that was that Doherty didn't die until, I think, the 1950s. And he said on his deathbed, as I understand it, that he didn't blame Wheeler at all. Wheeler was onto him and got him. And he wished it hadn't happened, but couldn't blame Wheeler. So he was a good sport anyway. Maybe not as good a crook as a sport. So anyway, that was Wheeler's committee, and that's what he used to get Doherty out of office. Those guys sided with him and sent a recommendation to the floor. And at first, Woodrow Wilson protected Doherty, and when it got too hot, he booted him out, got his resignation. Yeah, that's Doherty. No big deal. Okay. Well, this Doherty thing was going on. Doherty was a tough guy, you know, and he thought, well, I'll get some people in my Justice Department, because he was Attorney General, to find some dirt on Wheeler out in Montana, and we'll impeach him. So he sent some guys out and they came up with a phony, Wheeler had represented an oil man, the name of Gordon Campbell, on the Sweetgrass Hills, north of Shelby. And they thought they could find something wrong with that. So anyway, they brought an action against him, and when it got to the jury acquitted Wheeler in 10 minutes. Well, this is almost made for a movie kind of a thing, because Doherty looked like a villain, and he probably was. And Wheeler was just the young white knight in shining armor. And so that was, I think, maybe in the Washington Post, I don't know, it was in a major Eastern newspaper. And it shows how young, gallant Burton K. Wheeler, still handsome, came clean and was a good guy, and so on. Let's see, where are we now? Hit it again, Jacob. And so, a few years after this, they both made the cover of Time magazine within a year or two of each other, and I don't remember which came first. But Tom Walsh, maybe this is the best time to tell this story. This is one of my favorite stories. The 1924 Democratic National Convention was in Madison Square Garden in August, sweltering heat. And their party rule then was that the nominee of the Democratic Party had to have a 2/3 majority of the delegates. Well, there was a grudge match between William G. McAdoo from Virginia, who was pro-Ku Klux Klan, and Al Smith. And Al Smith, who was a Catholic from New York. And so there were various people who thought, well, they'll never compromise with each other, and neither one of them is ever going to get two-thirds majority. So a half a dozen favorite sons also entered the contest. You know, the governor of Wisconsin and the governor of Florida and so forth. And the Democrats had chosen as their Democratic National Convention chairman, Senator Tom Walsh from Montana. And Walsh kind of looked like a senior politician and that sort of thing. And they also liked the fact that he would remind people of the Teapot Dome scandal. So Walsh wasn't anything if he wasn't proper. He even wore a necktie to dinner. And he had rectitude coming out his ears. And so Walsh is standing up there presiding over the convention, and what they do is they call Delaware, and the convention chairman would say, Delaware, the proud whatever state, Blue Hen State, I think, proudly cast 2 votes for Walsh and two votes for, my brain is going cuckoo here. But they divided their delegation. And then the next delegation would be a larger one. And they'd split their delegation maybe 3 ways because they had a favorite son. And then somebody in the 4th state that he'd call would say, Mr. Chairman, I demand to poll the delegation. That meant that he didn't think that the chairman of the delegation had given an accurate count. So everybody in the delegation had to be called by name. And I don't remember for sure. There's probably somebody here in this room that knows, because it shattered all records for the length of the political convention. They went something like 122 ballots. And Walsh is an old guy, and it's really hot. And he's just struggling, and they go through ballot after ballot, and maybe just like 3 or 4 votes would change. Maybe none would change. So I think it was the Philadelphia delegation, and they asked to be polled, and it would take a long time to do it. And they would do this day after day after day. So Tom Walsh, in spite of his reputation and his purity and his decency and that sort of thing, took the gavel, threw it down on the podium and said, "Ah, shit." And that would have been enough. But he didn't know what this thing that said mutual, and this said NBC, and this one said CBS. He didn't really understand them. There hadn't been any, but this was the first political convention that was broadcast over radio. And H.L. Mencken, who was an interesting old reporter and satirist and that sort of thing, heard that across the street and made note of it, and it, I think, was published in the Washington paper, maybe it was the Baltimore paper, but my gosh, they covered it up pretty well, because a lot of people claim, you know, that they didn't ever hear it, or maybe some of them couldn't believe their ears, I don't know. And so I had heard that was an old political gavel over in Helen in the Historical Society, and I thought maybe that's it. And so I went over and looked, and it was made out of anthracite coal. But it was used in the 28 convention, not the 24 convention, my heart sank. So, I don't know whatever happened to the gavel, probably got thrown in the waste paper basket or something. But anyway, that's a good story to tell. And can you move that one, Rick, the one coming up?
Mr. Smith.
Why did I call you Rick? Move number 10
Okay,
between 17 and 16,
so do you wanna go to number 11?
and then we'll just go right on to number 11.
Okay,
Number 11 is the cabin that Wheeler and his family owned up on the Lake McDonald, and some of you maybe have seen that. I got a chance to spend some time there and visit the family, that sort of thing, and also Senator Walsh's family. And I'm going to tell you a story in a minute here that Senator Walsh's granddaughter told me that's a great one. You know, well, maybe I can tell it now. Walsh and Wheeler had cabins near each other on the north end of Lake McDonald, where the inlet that is. And they decided they were going to make a fishing trip from the cabin, and it was a 2 or 3 mile horseback ride, maybe to Evangeline Lake. Does that sound possible? I think it was a fairly well-known lake, but it was a short distance. I mean, like miles, but not a lot of miles. And so Walsh had a son-in-law by the name of Captain Emil Gudger. He was a naval officer. And he thought, I can really score a point with my wife's dad. And so Walsh was stern. You know, he looked stern, and he was. So Gudger had a big inflatable rubber raft that came out by rail from back east, and got it to the Walsh cabin, the Walsh Wheeler cabin. And they put the big raft on a horse, big sturdy pack horse, and took it to this lake. And Walsh, just like you might imagine, didn't take his tie off when he did fly casting, but he was a real good fly caster and kind of a perfectionist about it. Wheeler kind of liked his whiskey, and he liked his cigars, and he had a big family. Walsh just had the one daughter, and one of the things they loved to do was invite the Indians over from Browning, and they'd have a lot of fun playing Indian games. His kids would do this with the Indian kids and that sort of thing, and Walsh got a big kick out of it, and it was kind of how their family was. So they all the kids filed on behind this pack horse, and they got to the lake, and then Walsh was standing there as usual. There's never been a picture taken of Tom Walsh smiling. I challenge you, I'll give you $100 if you can find any picture of Tom Walsh that's got a smile on his face. So they got to the lake, and I guess he had a pump, but Captain Gudger pumped the raft up, and he so well wanted it to be really a good hit with the father-in-law and that sort of thing. So they got in the rubber raft, and Walsh got in first, and then Captain Gudger in the middle, and Wheeler in the end, so that Walsh could have plenty of room to fly cast. Then they went around the lake and had pretty good luck, and it was about time for them to head in for lunch. So they headed back up to the shore, and they did it in such a way that Captain Gudger was closest to shore, so he came out of the boat, Wheeler, cigar in mouth, came out of the boat, and when he did, the boat went that. And Walsh went up right about to his beezer in the lake. And the lady that told me this story was Walsh's granddaughter. And she said his mustaches were straight down. And there was just violent anger in his eyes. And so poor Captain Gudger, for all his work, just wound up to be the brunt of the whole thing. And Wheeler himself was up on the shore stifling a laugh with the kids, along with the kids. And this guy, well, that must have been, it had to have been Ellen Gudger, Walsh's granddaughter, said that you couldn't tell a story that more perfectly depicted the two men. Wheeler was a wheeler dealer and a good-natured sort of the guy, just as long as you didn't cross him. And many friends, but a few enemies. And Tom Walsh was as circumspect as he could be. Everything had to be done right and by the numbers. And if it didn't happen that way, you were going to be in trouble with him. And she said that tells the story of those two men as well as any story ever could. And I don't think you'll hear that from anybody else, because I don't think anybody else knows that story. So. That's their cabin, the Wheeler cabin. The Walsh cabin, I think, is still there. I think it survived the fire. Where are you now, Jim?
Jack's Hunt, right there.
Okay. Well, I think I included that so I could tell you that there's never been a picture of Tom Walsh smiling in my exhibit. But anyway, he looked so senatorial too. Montanans were so proud of him. And he was, I'm sure, dirt honest, completely honest. But he didn't have much of a sense of humor. Okay. I can't see. Okay, that's 1924. Remember, Wheeler's only been in the U.S. Senate for 2 years. And he's already made a reputation for himself. He's also well known all over the country just in his first term. And so he accepts an invitation on the part of a Republican senator from Wisconsin, Robert LaFollette, who was again a Roosevelt progressive. And LaFollette didn't like the Republicans, didn't like the Democrats. In fact, there's a funny story about that too that I don't think I remember well enough to go into, but anyway, he said something to the effect that the Republicans and Democrats can't come up with two guys more qualified to be president than that guy than I'll run. So he did, and he got Wheeler to run with him for vice president. And so you'd think, well, hey man, you're just a brand new freshman U.S. senator, and you're kind of trying to break in here. What in the heck are you doing that? But Wheeler, one thing he had was guts. There was an old Democrat congressman who was later Speaker of the House by the name of John Nance Cactus Jack Garner. More about him in a little bit here, but Garner said Wheeler is the one essential characteristic of a United States senator, guts. And he had that. And so anyway, Wheeler ran with LaFollette, and they, of course, got skunked. They were the third party running against the Democrat and the Republican. But the story that really tells the tale about that was when they couldn't qualify the Progressive Party ticket for presidential electors, if they would have won any electors,